All right, welcome back from lunch, everybody. I'm really happy that everybody's had a chance to walk outside on this beautiful day and enjoy lunch over at Walker. I want to introduce our next keynote speaker, who I had the opportunity and the pleasure of sitting next to at dinner last night, and learned a lot about her, including about her dog, which was very sweet. And she can tell you more if she wants to later. But in all seriousness, she went into a lot of detail, and I loved it, around the resilience work that she does. Nancy Kete, Dr. Nancy Kete, is the managing director at the Rockefeller Foundation. She leads the foundation's global work on resilience and helps the whole organization focus on infusing the organization with resilience thinking and bring this to all areas of their work. So before joining the Rockefeller Foundation, Nancy spent 13 years at the World Resources Institute, where she was first the director of Climate, Energy, and the Climate, Energy, and Pollution program. And then she was the founder and director of EMBARQ, a program that catalyzed environmentally sustainable transport solutions to improve the quality of life in cities in Mexico, Brazil, India, Turkey, and the Andean region, which sounds really, really interesting. So last note that is really impressive that I wanted to share is that she also served on President Obama's National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling as senior advisor on corporate risk and safety management. So thank you, Nancy, for coming and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, Marilyn. I have had such a good time today. I'm really pleased that I was invited to be an ambassador. My overwhelming urge now is to get the name changed, as we talked about yesterday morning. So I'll keep working on that. It's been exciting for me to have had a couple of days of talking about energy, because I don't really work on energy at the Rockefeller Foundation after having spent my whole career working on it. First with acid rain, then in climate change, and then in transportation. So it's quite strange to have spent the past 2.5 years hardly touching on energy at all. So I've had a catch-up course over the past couple of days, and it's been really fun. It was a thrill for me to see one of the posters out there where the work was done with EMBARQ Mexico office, not really an office, 100 people down there. And that was our first bus rapid transit project when we first started EMBARQ in 2001. And it's still the most successful of the EMBARQ networks. So that was fun to just see that as a side benefit of coming up here. The foundation's been working on resilience and had resilience as a focus of one of the most important concepts for the 21st century for almost a decade. With our latest grant that was announced today with the new Secretary of HUD, we've probably hit the $500 million mark in our spending on resilience. What was announced today is not what I'm going to talk about, but it's exciting. We're going to partner with HUD on a national disaster resilience competition. And what we're going to do is essentially launch a series of, or support a series of what we're calling resilience camps to help the communities around the US who are eligible to compete for about $1 billion in HUD funding. It's the last $1 billion of the $60 billion Sandy recovery money. So we'll sponsor resilience camps around the country to help these communities successfully compete for HUD's money. And that's building off of a really big project called Rebuild by Design that was just the Sandy affected communities were eligible for that. So we've been busy, but in the resilience camp, we will have 4 main parts to the curriculum. And the first is essentially, what is resilience? And we were working on that before Sandy hit. And after Sandy hit, a lot of my own personal work was directed towards rebuilding the Sandy affected area in a much more resilient way. But that didn't get us out of the work that we were doing for the longer term to try to get a lot more rigorous on what we meant by resilience, and in particular, what we meant by resilient cities. And this is what I want to focus on with you today. And I guess as an example, to show you how long we've been thinking about this, I wanted to mention that in Back in 1958, Jane Jacobs, who was a community activist at the time, received a Rockefeller Foundation grant to expand upon her ideas of how a city should look, feel, and work. And the book she published was The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which maybe for you young engineers, you might not know what that is, but for anybody who works in cities or as an urban planner, it's kind of the Bible for how to think about cities from the point of view of the people who live there. And she stood up against Robert Moses, who was sort of the dynamo of urban planning. And one of the things we talk about in the context of Rebuild by Design, this big program we just are working on with HUD, it was like the projects are like love children of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. The community activists bottom up, working finally with the formal, organized, highly skilled expertise. And we're pretty happy that in the case of all these really exciting designs in the New York area, they came together, both the external experts and the community experts working peacefully together, which does not always happen. The charge with respect to articulating what urban resilience is that we put to ARUP, International Development, was that we worked up together a little over a year ago, was that by this spring, we needed to be able to articulate what urban resilience is in a measurable, evidence-based, and accessible way that would be able to inform urban planning practices and investment patterns in order to enable better urban communities. The parentheses on poor are vulnerable, businesses, coastal. There's lots of different kinds of communities to enable these communities to survive and thrive multiple shocks and stresses. That's just a sense at the beginning. If you just make a Wordle, if you Google and then make a Wordle of what comes up if you put in urban resilience or resilience, you get all kinds of things, but abilities, systems, capacity, functions, shocks really dominate. When I got to the foundation, they had already done a literature review on resilience, and one of the main points that struck me was the idea that we may never actually be able to measure resilience itself because resilience is very tightly related to the idea of complexity, and it is an emergent property. So to get a grip on it, we got to be able to relate resilience to other properties that you might have some ability to ascertain through observation. And that has proven to be kind of a guidepost for this empirical work. And in the course of the work, we reviewed all the indicators, literature on cities, everything we could find on measuring resilience. There wasn't anything really detailed at the time when we started 2 years ago on urban resilience. And we sort of took a step back and said, well, what are we talking about? And what we're talking about rests on trying to understand what cities do. And what cities do is they do things for people. And what they do are essentially those 8 functions across the top. And if a city's functioning well, it's able to deliver basic needs, safeguard human life, protect and maintain and enhance the assets that are there, facilitate social, cultural identity and human relationships, promote information, education, and innovation, defend the rule of law, justice, and equity, support livelihoods, and stimulate economic progress. That's why people go to cities. And when you have a lot of people aggregated together in places we call cities or urban areas, it takes these functions all have to work together to ensure that they all happen. Then there are all these shocks and stresses that places are vulnerable to, and you can't really get rid of the vulnerabilities. And one thing I found when I started working on resilience was people had, in my view, a misperception that resilience was the opposite of vulnerability. And I didn't think it was. I think resilience is the opposite of collapse. So our places are always going to be vulnerable to those circles. If you're not resilient, if you can't help your city be resilient, it's going to collapse. You're going to have real failure. So what resilience is the capacity to deal with these vulnerabilities without collapsing in one or more of those functions. This is one of the reasons, this is a little bit of an older PowerPoint, but the reason I wanted to use it for this group is the other thing that was really noticeable even before Sandy, but in a way after Sandy, I'll get back to that in a second. When we did the literature review, although all of those functions are what are important and equally important for a city, that they define essentially a city. When you look at the literature on resilience, it is dominated by the infrastructure journal articles or the disaster risk reduction writing. It's as if those last 5 things that a city does don't matter, or resilience doesn't matter, or these don't count. So there is a very skewed idea of the relationship of cities and resilience, like those didn't count. The way that shows up in real life is post-Sandy, I live in New York, there were 2 different conversations and they were not happening in the same room. You could go to meetings where it was all the communities or the community activists, and they knew that resilience was about them and what they did. And you wouldn't find an infrastructure expert in the room with them. Or you'd go to a more technical place and you would have National Grid or somebody who related to them in the city or the PUC, and there wouldn't be very many community activists. And they knew that resilience was about them, but they wouldn't talk to each other. It wasn't the same universe, and it was reflected in literature. So that's like a shorthand for the lit review that went into building the framework and the index that's to come. A lot of the rest of the evidence that I'm going to show you the result of came from looking at case studies. The primary data came from case studies in the cities indicated by orange, and the secondary from the cities indicated by blue. In the 6 cities where the teams went out and interviewed hundreds of people, Concepcion was one. Remember, they had an earthquake a little bit after the Haiti earthquake. And this is one of my favorite quotes. The mayor said, in Concepcion, we had 2 earthquakes, the 8.81 and the social earthquake, which was looting and arson. He thought that the last one affected our soul most violently. And what happened really did shock the citizens of Concepcion and the other communities. Even though there was coming together to distribute water and to deal with this kind of effect where the building, very famous building, just broke apart. If you all recall, there was a military takeover in the 70s. Chile was governed for a long time by Augusto Pinochet. The president of Chile at the time of the earthquake 2 years ago had been captured and tortured by the military regime. And so it was extraordinarily difficult for her, but she nonetheless called out the army to bring order into civilian communities. It was an extraordinarily difficult call that she made, and it was, as indicated by this picture, supported by the populace because the looting and the arson was so terrifying. What I'm getting at is that it's hard to predict what a particular shock might do and the kind of stresses it might reveal in a society. In Surat is another case, and I'm going to go a little faster through this. It's a very interesting place where, at least according to a business person in the city of Surat, which is in Gujarat, whose former leader of that state has been elected the Prime Minister of India, that because there's such a scarcity of labor, they have to be nice to their immigrant employees, and they have to do a lot to retain them. They tried to understand their issues and treat them like family. I'm not sure that's completely widely held, but it is one of the most successful cities in India. But they have really severe flooding, and one of the floods led to the plague, and that shocked everybody because you really can't be a modern city in the world and attract inward investment if you have pneumonic plague. Cape Town, another story. Cali, yet another story. I wanted to show you this, and I'll leave this PowerPoint for you so you can go through it and the report that came from. In the resilience literature, and when people talk about it, they talk a lot about it as if it's all about shocks, things you're not expecting. But it varies a lot. So in Concepcion, they had just had the earthquake. When we did the interviews with hundreds of people there, it was resilient. What popped up, we never use the word resilience. They're questions that aren't designed to lead the answers. It's about shocks for them. In New Orleans, where everything happens, it's about shocks and stresses equally. In Surat, it's the same. In Semarang, it's much more about stresses. In Cali, there's a lot of violence because of the drug cartels and other reasons. It's mostly about stresses for them. In Cape Town, it's mostly about social stresses. So the point I'm leading to is the following. Resilience isn't about disaster risk reduction. It's not about risk planning, because all that is about planning for something particular. It's about having the capacity to deal with whatever is going to happen. And those are really different concepts, and that's a big part of the reveal of this work. And it takes you in different places. Even though you still need to do your risk plans for particular things, and that contributes to the resilience of your place, it isn't the same thing. This I don't have time to go through, but you will notice that those vertical bars aren't the same size. And the business community, the government community, and the civil society people who were interviewed in this different cities had very different ideas of what was important. And so in many places, you could almost call it a tale of three cities. You'd notice in the middle, for example, business doesn't think that there were issues with respect to essential needs provision when you aggregate it, but government and civil society do. Social harmonization over on the far right is a huge issue for social society and the general public, not so much for business. That's not a very resilient place if you get that kind of answer, because you have very different notions of what's going on in your city. I'm going to skip that, not enough time. This is the final city resilience framework. It's a lens, should look like a camera lens. Don't try to read it. I'm going to break it apart. You'll hurt your eyes if you try to read it right now. But it's a lens through which the complexity of cities and the drivers that contribute to a city's resilience can be understood. So this is a buildup of a lot of things, and I'm going to show you the buildup. But first, I want to say that we've been testing it as we've been building it up through the Foundation's other program, a big program we have called the 100 Resilient Cities, and have been working with this in the first 33, getting a lot of feedback and changing it. It's changed from being just a framework that'll help us build an index to a framework that'll actually help set strategies, because we started this before we had 100 resilient cities. So at the highest level of 4, that whole whirligig divides into 4 dimensions. City resilience is really about people, it's about place, it's about organization, and it's about knowledge. And you can't pick the part you like and think if you invest all your energy on the bits you're interested in, you will be increasing your city's resilience, and ignore the rest of it. You can pick the parts you're good at and be cognizant of the rest of it and make sure somebody else is working on the rest of it. That's okay. Nobody's good at everything. But just diving deep on the bits you're interested in and selling that as enhancing your city's resilience is doing a disservice. So up at the top, the bits that are about people, it's about the health and well-being of everyone living and working in the city. This is where the equity comes in. So a city has to be able to ensure basic needs are met, livelihoods and employment are good, health and emergency services. the place. About place, this is the way in which man-made and natural infrastructure provides critical services and protects and connects urban citizens. I'm going to stop here a second because I think most people in this room work for a living down in this quadrant. So what was really interesting in the interviews, in the primary research we did, almost no one thought that what was needed to increase the resilience in those three cities was more infrastructure. When infrastructure came up, it was in the context of making sure it was available no matter what happened, or making sure that the services that the infrastructure was there for was available. And those are really different answers and different concepts. And even after Sandy, when the foundation co-chaired Governor Cuomo's infrastructure commission, a lot of the early conversation starts as, well, it's about the infrastructure. Who cares about infrastructure? You want what the infrastructure does for you. And if you start there, you wind up in a really different conversation. So if you think about protective infrastructure, not the infrastructure, what's it protecting? Well, then you could really quickly wind up in talking about, well, this could be green or it could be gray or it could be a mix of green and gray. It could be something different than the original infrastructure that was there. And if you think about critical services, you can wind up someplace completely different than if you're just building what you thought you needed to have. Interestingly, from the interviews, we pulled mobility and communications out because it's a kind of infrastructure that is so critical today. And an example of that is in Concepcion, and I think there's potential for this to happen in the United States as well. With the advent of broadband, a lot of emergency radio bandwidth is being given away. And in Chile, that had happened. So when the earthquake hit, there was no way to get emergency radio services. You know, the beep was gone. That little piece of the spectrum was gone. And that is why there was one of the reasons why there was so much civil unrest. Nobody had any information. That nobody had credible, accurate information. Finally, one radio station got up and going, Radio Bio Bio, and that helped calm things down a lot. But the old-fashioned idea that the radio spectrum is actually a public good that's there for public use and that some of it needs to remain for emergency purposes, I think needs to be revisited, and that even though it's redundant to other ways of communicating, you need that kind of redundancy and you need the diversity of ways to get information, I think needs to come back up to the fore. I've got my 5-minute mark. Organization, this is where the social resilience ideas come in, that it matters if you have senses of identity and mutual support, that finance and funds are available, where the ideas of where social stability and security come in, and then your kind of leadership quadrant. The way this builds out is there were 12 of those indicators. There are 50 or so sub-indicators and then 150 or so variables which are going to be measurable. That just gives you an example. I want to flip through this because there's not time to go into it and it would be very boring. Show you quickly the plague slide. So when the plague hit, they had to break down the silos because it was spreading and not being dealt with effectively until the government department heads just empowered themselves to take action independently while putting in place measures for accountability. And so the way that triggers is, you had your leadership and accountability, and then you had to have some of your infrastructure kicking in, and this is then your health, your high-level indicator on your health side. And this is just an example how we build this up. In New Orleans after Katrina, and as an aside, I just resaw the film by Spike Lee, When the Levees Broke, and we're coming up to the 10th anniversary of Katrina, I think. If you haven't seen that movie or you haven't seen it again, you should see it. now in New Orleans, they held a contest, and they have these public art stations that tell people where to go to evacuate, and what, if they're taking animals, what they can do, because that was a big part of the tragedy of Katrina. So it raises awareness of evacuation procedures within the communities in which they're placed. And then into our little whirligig, it sort of tells you which parts of resilience this helps with, and the community action in New Orleans. And then in Concepcion, the people side, the leadership side, the livelihood side are indicated by how the businesses, some of them redeployed staff to other stores while a shopping center was being rebuilt. We saw a lot of this in New York after Sandy. So that's it. I'm done 2 minutes before my 2 minutes. This is just a last slide to say this has been a really fun collaboration with Arup International Development, who's done most of the hard brain work on it. My colleagues at 100 Resilient Cities, who have to go out and explain this in places where hardly anybody has thought about this, and they're really using this as a starter discussion to lead cities very quickly to start to develop strategies to make their own city more resilient. That's how we're getting this good feedback, and my own colleagues at the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you very much. So that leaves us 6 or 7 minutes for questions. Questions?
Hi, I'm Caroline Golan. I'm from Georgia Tech, and this is very much my dissertation focus, so this is great. And I was wondering, I know you had to go through quickly, if you could talk about, in academia, it's very easy, especially in the engineering side, to give metrics for how you quantify resilience and returns to the grid and energy use and water use and where they're vulnerable aspects. But if you could talk a little more about how you define a population group or people group as vulnerable and what goes into making that sort of decision, that would be great. Because I'm struggling with that in my research, and I know a lot of people are in trying to integrate the behavioral and sort of the technical side of it.
So on the first pass of this, let me get a picture. This is probably the easiest quadrant to deal with. On the first pass of this that we're doing with Arup for the whole circle, what they're doing is on the outside 150 or 60 variables. They have found that about 50% of those, there are data for those globally from other people's data sets. In most cases, those won't be differentiated by income or racial diversity or other kind of markers, to the best of my knowledge. And then there's about 50% that we don't even have them. So then we'll start some new field work with some of the 100 resilient cities. In New York, we have a different project with a different project manager that is looking at income diversity, the impacts of the widening income inequality. And we've had some coordination between Arup and the team leading that to look at how in New York they're collecting these income indicators for especially a lot of this set. And then we're going to, on the next round, try to see how many of the variables, which won't be all of them, where we would think that income difference and then eventually potentially racial difference or tribal difference would make a difference, and could we collect that information? And one of the people working on this in New York and the other project used to work in the UN, and he's done a lot of this in places with, in very difficult places, like in internally displaced persons camp. So that won't be in the index when it first comes out, but we're learning how to do it in New York first and with this guy from the UN, and then we hope to build it in the next round. Because the final point is the plan for this is to put it up online, to license it, not to make money from it, but sort of like the Myers-Briggs and other psychological tests. So anytime anybody uses it, they have to put their data back up. so that we can make it more and more robust over time from getting larger and larger elements in it, because we don't know any other way to improve it, if that helps. Did I run out of time?
Yes, you did.
Oh, well.
Only, and I just want to say, only because one of the presenters has a plane to catch, so
Okay.
we're trying to keep on time. But Nancy will be here, and I hope people will catch up with her. We have a break in like 15 minutes,
Okay.
so thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right.